Welcome to the Tempo Storm Meta Snapshot Breakdown. As the meta has finally settled down, there have been less additions to the meta, which means decks are focusing on changing lists in order to counter what they're playing against. The current game plan that almost every deck has to consider is, how do we beat Hunter? Hunter is by far the favorite in the meta, and as such is the only deck in Tier 1. Its power level is unmatched, and it continues to prey on virtually every deck. Tier 2 is much wider and features an array of decks that all have different game plans. Before we break down the top decks of this snapshot, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's take a look at the sole deck in Tier 1, Mid-Range Hunter. As previously mentioned, Hunter is by far the strongest class in the standard meta. No other deck can do as much as the Hunter can, and very few decks can consistently beat it. Hunter has all the tools that it needs to win any matchup right now, whether it be through minion pressure or with Deathstalker Rexar. Mid-range Hunter can find a way out of almost any predicament. It's clear to see that Hunter is overtuned, but once the rotation hits and it loses Deathstalker Rexar, it'll see a huge fall in power level. Mid-range Hunter's best matchup comes from combo decks such as Quest Rogue. The Rogue can't deal with the early game threats that the Hunter has, preventing them from safely finishing their quest. On the other hand, Hunter's worst matchup is against Odd Control Mage. The 2 damage hero power that the Mage has with all their removal spells prevents the Hunter from ever applying early pressure, and by the end of the game, Frost Lich Jaina will prevent the Hunter from easily developing again. Until rotation comes with the new expansion, expect to see Hunter as the only deck in Tier 1. It'll continue to dictate the meta, and other decks will have to take Hunter into consideration when building their lists. Seeing decks shift in power is never unexpected as the meta develops. As different decks become more popular, other decks rise in response or fall due to its bad matchups. The interesting change that occurred this week is the rise of Pirate Rogue from the bottom of Tier 4 to the top of Tier 3. This deck was seen as more fun than competitive, but following Bunny Hopper's impressive run at the HCT Winter Championship using this deck, it gained a lot more traction. Players are much more aware of its power level now, and surprisingly enough, the deck has good matchups against all forms of Hunter, making the deck very well rounded. Tier 2 is home to all the decks that are strong but aren't mid-range Hunter. There's a lot of misfits in this tier that are just slightly too weak to be called the top decks in the meta. Let's look at all the decks in Tier 2 that separates them from Hunter. Even Warlock is the first deck in the second tier this week. Previously, it's found itself sitting in Tier 1, but fell out due to how different the power level is between it and mid-range Hunter. Even Warlock is still a very powerful deck, and is seeing a lot of play on both ladder and in open cups. Even Warlock excels against decks that struggle to deal with the removal that they have, such as Odd Paladin. Its poor matchups come from the decks that can deal with the early mountain giants and can apply consistent pressure. Following Even Warlock is Deathrattle Hunter. Due to how good Deathstalker Rexar simply is, any viable Hunter build will find a way to be competitive. Deathrattle Hunter is much less oppressive than its mid-range counterpart, but the deck is still quite successful. In order for Deathrattle Hunter to succeed, it wants to queue into decks that struggle to deal with the sticky minions, or the large late game threats. For example, Odd Control Mage has a lot of removal, but the Deathrattles prove to be too hard to interact with for the deck. On the flip side, decks like Odd Paladin that can easily ignore the Hunter's board are very bad matchups. Next up is Control Priest, an archetype that has been around for a very long time. Control Priest is one of the only decks with a positive win rate against Hunter, making it a pretty good deck for ladder. Aside from this matchup, Control Priest has a lot of favorables within the first 2 tiers. For example, decks such as Odd Paladin and Deathrattle Hunter can't really deal with the consistent board clears that the Control Priest can apply, and then often succumb to their late game burn. Control Priest is looking to avoid playing against combo decks such as Quest Rogue, as the combo decks can assemble their win condition while mostly ignoring the Priest. Many players are excited to see Quest Rogue rotate out with the coming expansion, but until then it sits happily on Tier 2. The ability that it has to stomp out any slow deck is unmatched, and with the addition of Lab Recruiter, players can't even try to fatigue the Quest Rogue. As expected, Quest Rogue preys on slow decks that typically have really slow win conditions, such as Odd Warrior or Odd Control Mage. In true combo style, Odd Rogue struggles against fast decks such as Mid-Range Hunter. Resurrect Priest takes the next slot in the tier list, making it the second combo deck in Tier 2. Being able to cheat out large minions and revive them has always been a tool Priest decks abuse, but this one is no exception. It has good matchups against decks that it can burst down like Odd Control Mage or even Warlock, but it struggles to compete against decks with significant pressure such as Midrange Hunter and Odd Paladin. Odd Control Mage follows the combo decks into tier 2. A lot of players felt that Odd Control Mage was slightly too weak, but in reality the deck has a lot of good matchups that it can abuse. For example, one of the deck's best matchups is in Midrange Hunter, which most decks simply struggle to beat. Odd Control Mage has a hard time beating combo decks such as Resurrect Priest, as the mage lacks the early pressure to prevent their opponent from assembling their combo pieces. Despite being nerfed, Odd Paladin returns to tier 2 this week. Odd Paladin joins the exclusive clubs of decks that consistently beat Midrange Hunter, making it a great deck for the current meta. However, Odd Paladin has inflated stats because of how forgiving the deck can be if misplayed. Odd Paladin's worst matchup is Control Priest, as the removal is far too difficult for the Paladin to play around. Rounding off tier 2 is Wall Priest. Wall Priest is one of the newest archetypes to be added to the snapshot, but is clearly holding its own against the top decks. Oftentimes, the Wall Priest can simply draw hands that are unbeatable for most decks, making it uninteractive. Wall Priest favors playing against decks that can't easily remove the large minions it plays, as it can then easily pull off its combo. One thing keeping the deck down is its bad matchup against Midrange Hunter. With Hunter being the most popular deck in the meta, having bad matchups against it can really hurt. The best course of action one can take to counter the current meta is trying to consistently beat Midrange Hunter. As annoying as it is, Hunter is right now the best deck, and it needs to be taken into account when deck building, or else your win rate will suffer. Even Paladin is a deck that can not only beat Midrange Hunter, but also has great matchups against other top decks like Quest Rogue and Resurrect Priest. Even Paladin has fallen in and out of the meta frequently, as it relies on good matchups being popular to make up for the deck's power level being on the weaker side. One thing Even Paladin struggles with is beating decks that are anti-aggro, like Control Priest. At the end of the day, Even Paladin is a well-rounded deck that can definitely take advantage of the current meta. While the meta is fairly diverse at the moment, it can feel really dull to play due to the large amount of Hunter players running around. With the upcoming expansion and rotation happening soon, there will be a huge meta shift, and that will make the game feel fresh again for those who are bored. Thank you for watching our snapshot breakdown. We hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to subscribe to the channel in order to keep up to date with our Hearthstone content as the new expansion rolls around the corner. Have a wonderful week.